Probably the oldest dream of mankind has been the dream to fly. Fly like the birds. But the birds, they have wings and we have not. The story officially begins with the Greek myth of Icarus and Daedalus. Icarus built a pair of wings. He flew, but he flew too high to the sun. The wings melted and he crashed. Actually, in 1988, a Greek pilot tried to fulfill the failed flight, and he flew from Crete to Santorini. Perhaps the closest you came to the dream of Icarus was in flying this training glider, a German Schulglider from the 1930s. The pilot sits in the front and feels the wind like the birds. Welcome to the dream of aviation. Welcome to Svedinos Bil and Aviation Museum. The dream of flying continued, and the first real aircraft carrying people was a hot air balloon constructed by the French brothers Montgolfier in 1783. They owned a paper factory, and because of that they made the balloon of paper. And they used the idea that hot air is lighter than cold air, and that made their first balloon fly. The Swedish aeronaut Solomon August André was the first to put into practice the idea of reaching the North Pole in a balloon. He developed a system for sails to steering the balloon. Alfred Nobel and the Swedish king Oscar II helped with funds for this expedition, 20,000 and 30,000 crowns respectively. In July 1897, three Swedes, André, Niels Strindberg and engineer Knut Frankel, rose to the sky with a balloon called the Eagle, and they disappeared into the wind. But in the fifth day, a carrier pigeon landed on the Norwegian vessel Alken with a note, "We are heading east, everything is all right." 33 years later, the Norwegian vessel Bratvåg found on the White Island the remains of the winter camp where André, Strindberg and Frankel spent their last days. But in addition to the remains of the expedition and their equipment, they found diaries and unexposed film. And in their diaries there were astronomical and other valuable data, and the films showed the last days of the explorers. And the Swedish king Gustav VI met the remains of André's expedition when it finally returned to Sweden. In the beginning of the last century, in France, a man named Louis Blériot tried to build an airplane. He experimented with different types, but not until 1909 he managed to get an aircraft that could fly. That was his Blériot Type 11. But at that time he was completely out of money. He had spent all his and his family's money on aircraft. But the English paper Daily Mail issued a prize of £10,000, an enormous amount of money at that time, for the first who could pass the English Channel in an aircraft. And in the summer of 1909, he managed to fly his aircraft over the Channel. He won the prize, he became a great hero of aviation, and all over the world everyone wanted Blériot aircraft. If you could fly over the Channel, then it must be fantastic aircraft. This specific aircraft is a Swedish-built copy of the Blériot 11, and it's called Thulin A. During the First World War, we had an aviation pioneer in Sweden called Thulin. He started a factory for development and production of aircraft, but he also had to set up a flying school. So the flying school was in Ljungbyhed in the southern part of Sweden, which is actually still a flying school after almost 100 years. And this specific aircraft is number 16 out of 23 built for the flying school from 1915 to 1918. This aircraft is a Focke-Wulf Stieglitz. It was built in the early 1930s in Germany by the Focke-Wulf Flugzeugbau. It was built as a display and aerobatic aircraft and flown by many German pilots at this time, and it was very successful. In 1936, the Swedish Air Force decided that it would buy a large number of those for use as primary trainer at the flying school at Ljungbyhed. Almost 100 of these aircraft were used during the war to train pilots. After the war, the aircraft were given away to air clubs, flying clubs all around Sweden, and used mainly as glider towing aircraft. And they were retired, most of them in the middle of the late 1960s. Kontakt. In the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936, glide flying was part of the Olympic Games. And for the planned Olympic Games in Helsinki in 1940, with even more importance to this part of the Games, and a standard gliding aircraft was developed in Germany for this event. The aircraft was even named Olympia, but for known reasons there was no Olympic Games in Helsinki in 1940. The Second World War started in 1939. This is the Junker Ju-52, an absolutely amazing aircraft, the first real modern airliner that entered service in the early 1930s. This three-engine aircraft was really the first modern airliner of the 1930s. All major airlines in Europe operated it, and it really built up the international air traffic in Europe. It could take around 14 passengers sitting comfortably inside the cabin, and it traveled at a speed of around 200 kilometers per hour. And this was a great step forward in passenger transportation. The Junkers was built in Germany at the Junkers aircraft factory in Dessau. And they started with the metal aircraft very early in the early 20s. They built metal aircraft when the rest of the world built aircraft out of wood and fabric. But the technology of its time was that they had to use corrugated metal, which is typical for Junker aircraft. It is strong. It is very lightweight, but not very aerodynamic, so the aircraft were not very fast. During the Second World War, the Junker turned out to be a very good military transportation aircraft as well. And obviously it was used a lot in the Luftwaffe in Germany, both for transportation but also for paratroopers. After the war, it was still in use by many airliners until well into the 1950s. Then it turned out to be too slow and too expensive to operate. Douglas Aircraft Company produced a large variety of aircraft during the war, both transportation aircraft and bombers. And by the way, it was Douglas that provided President Roosevelt with a personal aircraft in which he arrived together with Winston Churchill from the United Kingdom to the conference in Yalta in the Soviet Union in 1944. This is a Douglas Skyraider. It was produced and developed by the Douglas Aircraft Company in the United States. It came too late for the Second World War, but it was used in both Korea and the Vietnam Wars. It was developed for use on aircraft carriers, so as you can see, it has foldable wings. The most impressive of this aircraft is the engine. It's a Wright Cyclone engine, 18-cylinder radial engine with 2,500 horsepower and a volume of 57 liters. That is slightly more than a normal car. The Skyraider is now under restoration back to its original condition. After the First World War, the interest for civil aviation started to grow in many countries, not least in the United Kingdom. The British pioneer in aviation, Geoffrey de Havilland, he wanted a share of that market. And in 1925, he presented his DH60 Moss, this aircraft. It was a very light and very, very inexpensive aircraft compared to almost anything else. And the intention was to use it with the newly created flying clubs all over England. It was an easy aircraft to operate and easy to maintain. And it could also fold the wings backward. So you could just open a hatch and then the wings could fold. You could have the aircraft in your garage, you could put it behind your car, you can drive it to the airfield, fold up the wings, start and fly away. The de Havilland DH82 Tiger Moth is a development of the successful DH60 Moss that came in 1925. But with the Tiger Moth, the de Havilland had an aircraft that was very well suited for flight training, and it was adopted by many air forces in the 1930s as a primary training for young pilots. And during the Second World War, all pilots in the Royal Air Force started the training with the Tiger Moth, and it was produced in large numbers. After the war, many of those military Tiger Moths were given to flying clubs, and they were used as a general aviation aircraft, used for flight training and towing gliders. And it was in use into the 1970s, 1980s in many clubs. Today, it's a veteran aircraft which is loved by its pilots and gives an experience of flying as it used to be 50 years ago. You're sitting in the free air, feeling the wind. Here we have the director of photography who is on a test flight on a Tiger Moth, and you can see for yourself the experience and the view he has. At the end of the Second World War, jet fighters started to enter the battlefield, both in the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force. And it was soon obvious that the future belong to jet aircraft. The propeller aircraft has a top speed of around 700 kilometers per hour, and that is very, very hard to exceed. A jet aircraft has almost no limitation at all in speed. In the Swedish Air Force, it was a top priority after the war to convert to jet aircraft. And in 1946, only 1 year after the war ended, the first Vampire aircraft arrived from England, from the Halland factory. And above me in the air you can see the single-seater, the fighter variant of the Vampire, and several hundreds of these were introduced in the Air Force in the late 1940s. It became also a necessity to have a jet trainer, so new pilots could have a jet training in a two-seater before going to single-seaters. So in 1955, the Swedish Air Force started to take deliveries of a twin-seater variant of the Vampire. And this is the aircraft I'm sitting in now. So the student started the training in a propeller aircraft, the Saab Zafir, and then after 50 flying hours they converted to this twin-seat Vampire. And after another half year they started to fly single-seater jet aircraft.
Okay, we transition to 7 here. 203, Alpha, tweaking measures. Hawk 6-4, Mike, affirmative. Left turn on 7, hold short of runway 31, right, you're behind it.
When the Second World War ended, everyone thought that now we will have a period of peace, and at Saab, the Swedish manufacturer of military aircraft, they desperately looked for ideas for the civil market. And it turned out to be 3 projects which they engaged in. The Saab 90 Scandia was a passenger aircraft. The Saab 91, a small propeller aircraft intended for traveling for businessmen, and Saab 92, the car. So that's where the 9 in the Saab car models came from. The Saab 91, the Zafir, which I'm sitting in now, was designed in 45, 46 and turned out to be a very, very good aircraft to fly. It soon became a standard military trainer in many different air forces, including the Swedish Air Force. It was liked by the pilots, liked by the teachers. It was easy to fly, but still a very good aircraft for flight training. In Scandinavia, apart from Sweden, it was used both in Norway and in Finland. And I'm sitting in an aircraft that belonged to the Finnish flying school. The aircraft, despite being old, is still flying today in many different flying clubs, and hopefully it will continue to fly for many years to come. Since the beginning of history, man dreamt about flying. But for many, many people, it was too expensive, too complicated to fly. So a French guy, Henri Minier, he created his own design of a very easy, very simple aircraft that everyone more or less could build by themselves and fly. And in 1934, he presented his design and his aircraft, and in a book that described how to build it. In 1935, he flew over the Channel, and it was a very popular aircraft. People made it themselves out in the countryside and flew with them. There were many accidents, but that was mainly because people built them didn't know to fly. They just tried, and sometimes they learned how to fly, sometimes not. The design is very, very simple. There's no elevator. You control the pitch with the stick, with moving the upper wing, and turning you did also with the stick, and you moved the rudder and the throttle for the engine. Those were the controls, so everyone can fly this. This is another very interesting aircraft. It's an American-built Air Cup from 1947. But the history of this aircraft goes back to the late 1930s, when Air Cup tried to build an aircraft that should be so easy to fly that everyone could take a flying license in it. It has a nose wheel, probably one of the first aircraft in the world designed with a nose gear, even if it came in production after the war. It also has interconnected ailerons and rudders. Normally you control the rudders at the rear with the pedals and the ailerons at the wings with the stick or the steering wheel. In this aircraft they are interconnected, so when you turn the wheel, both move simultaneously, so you don't have any pedals in this aircraft. It was still not too easy to fly for inexperienced pilots, and experienced pilots, they wanted the separate control over the rudder with the pedals. But the promotion said that if you can drive a car, you can fly the Air Cup. But it didn't turn out to be that success. But one interesting feature is that since it has no pedals, disabled people using wheelchairs, people who can't use their legs or their feet, they can actually take a flying license and fly Air Cups. So that is the reason, one reason at least, why so many Air Cup are still flying today.